everyone. Looks like we've got quite a few people logged in now, so we're going to go ahead and kick off the session. Again, thank you for joining us today for our supply chain chat about accelerating trends toward reshoring and why it matters. Today we have Stephanie and Rosemary on the call today. Their videos are on as well. They'll be running the session for us. But before we kick things off, I do want to go over some housekeeping. Feel free to submit questions in the Q&A tool in the toolbar here for Zoom. I will be monitoring those, and we will be asking some questions of Stephanie and Rosemary today. We also will have some polling questions that pop up on your screen, so keep an eye out for those. We will let you know when those pop up as well. But we'd love to get some interaction from the team and the visitors today. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. Again, I said this is Stephanie. She is our 3G CRO and COO. And we have Rosemary Coates joining us today as a special guest. She is the founder and executive director of the Reshoring Institute. So we are very excited to have her as a guest here today. Let's kick off some of our discussion topics today. Today, Stephanie and Rosemary will be going over cost optimization and cost competitiveness in regards to reshoring, as well as capacity issues and constraints that we might be seeing here and some concerns that we might have. Driving optimization within the manufacturing environment, improving customer satisfaction with reshoring. And again, like I had mentioned, we will be doing some QA. So keep an eye out for some polling questions as well. Here's our first set of questions we're going to kick off here. I'll launch the session or the polls here. If you guys could go ahead and answer those. When you see those pop up, there's two that will come across your screen here right now. So give a few more minutes to get some votes in. Looks like they're coming in.
I tried to vote too. Doesn't let me.
Oh man.
No hosting allowed. No hosting. You can't bias the polls.
From this. So we got 50% of our attendees today say cost optimization is the biggest concern about manufacturing back, bringing manufacturing back home. So, all right. So, Rosemary, Stephanie, I'll let you guys kick it off and start going over our main key topics today. So,
yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
First, Rosemary, thanks for joining today in our supply chain chat. It's much appreciated. It's always a fun and rare opportunity when we can have such experts join in, and I'm sure our audience is going to appreciate a lot of your inputs. Why don't you take just a minute, if you don't mind, Rosemary, and give a little bit of background about yourself and the Reshoring Institute, just to get some context of the level of expertise that we're talking about here.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Always an opportunity to talk about reshoring is a happy day. So I have spent about 30 plus years in global manufacturing and global supply chains. Working in industry at Hewlett Packard, and then in management consulting for 25 years. And during that period of time, especially the last 15 years or so, mostly working in China and helping companies offshore their production to China, because in the late 90s and early 2000s, that was the thing to do. That's what most executives wanted, and I was facilitating that and became sort of an expert in Chinese manufacturing. And then in the 2012 presidential election, both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama were China bashing like crazy. And I'm like, oh man, I can't tell anybody what I do for a living. This is really awful. But at that point, also, a lot of executives started rethinking their global manufacturing strategy and asked us if we could help evaluate whether or not they might be able to reestablish manufacturing in America. That was really the beginning of the trend, which kind of bubbled along. It was fairly slow growth, but the trend was certainly upward and ticking off pretty well. So eventually, about 7 years ago, we started the Reshoring Institute to complement the other work that we were doing. And it's a 501c3 nonprofit, and we help companies evaluate and execute manufacturing in the U.S. We have a dual mission. One is to, through our research and our consulting work, we help companies reshore. And then we also take graduate student interns and we teach them about manufacturing because they're going to be the manufacturing leaders of the future. So mostly MBA students and engineers in graduate programs across America. We're actually affiliated with 12 universities. And we've had, I think, 29 interns now over those years. These are paid internships. And our interns help us with our research and help us with our consulting projects. So things are going gangbusters now, as you can imagine, especially after the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things as we go in and talk specifically, I don't think there's a surprise in the poll responses around the cost optimization, cost competitiveness. You and I had a chance to talk a couple of weeks ago to the Women in Manufacturing group, and it was a similar vein of really understanding that at the end of the day, things become an economic decision. But while we're focusing the conversation today a lot on reshoring into the US and some of the accelerants there, the reality is that the EU is also having the same conversations. In fact, I was reading a study the other day that EU Parliament put out, and it was crossing over all of the same discussion points and what were the driving factors. So I think just for the audience's perspective, if we do have some global manufacturers in the mix, the things that we're seeing here as trends and the things that we're going to be speaking about are exactly the same types of trends that we're seeing overseas.
Yeah, and in fact, at the Reshoring Institute, we have been involved with a group called Makers Rise across Europe. And it is a collaboration with the EU and a bunch of universities. I think there must be about 20 European universities, mostly economics professors and supply chain professors, who are trying to reestablish manufacturing in Europe as well. So reshoring is certainly a trend in the US, but it's also in Europe. It's a very, very...
And the drivers, you spoke about kind of the move that had been to offshore. Now we've got a bunch of drivers that are coming in to say, you know, whether it's nearshore, backshore, reshore, whatever we want to call it, on where things are, where there's this movement. But it's in part, if we just cover some of the areas, there's economic factors that are coming to play. I think you mentioned to me in the past of some of the, I wouldn't call it parity, but the level of differentiation between wage costs across countries starting to come more on par, right? So I think we can talk about that. We obviously have a geopolitical climate that's contributing to where things are. Then you've got all of the elements that come in from a world of if there's a tsunami or the resilience, supply chain resilience aspects of it. But it's interesting, I think, post-pandemic, because there also, I think, was a focus then on I may need to bring some of these things that are more vital to my local economy back home. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we jump quickly into the cost optimization pieces, the drivers that went into it?
Yeah, so there have been a few trends that have contributed to the popularity of reshoring. So certainly the tax reform bill of 2017 helped level the playing field in terms of we had manufacturers were being taxed at about 30%, and that brought down their tax rate to 21%. In the world, manufacturers are taxed at about 24% on average. So we're actually below average. So that helped. That's one of those cost structure things that, was important. When we look at labor rates across the world, so we did at the Reshoring Institute, we did a study and we looked at labor rates in various countries, but we compared a machine tool operator in China, for example, to the same job description in the US and the same job description in Europe. So this is a machine tool operator. It's working on the factory floor. In China, that operator earns $4.63 an hour. In the US, same job, $26.10 an hour. And in Europe, it's even higher, $32 and change per hour. Fully burdened. So you can see that even though the press is reporting that labor rates are going up in China and that's the reason and so forth, that's not the reason. people are evaluating, because even if labor rates quadruple in China, it's still not as expensive as it is in the US to manufacture. So labor rates are a contributing factor for sure. If you have a high touch labor environment, then you should be looking for a low cost environment. But if you can extract the labor costs through automation or re-engineering, then you can come in close proximity to the costs to manufacture in the US and Europe. So, there are those economic factors for sure that contribute to it. And having a look at competitiveness around the world is it's more complicated. It's not straightforward. It's not just, we're comparing one labor rate to another. You have to factor in all the other things like automation and 3D printing and robotics and things that are going to help you extract cost out of your manufacturing environment.
So practically speaking, there's going to be segments of the industry that are going to be maybe better suited to be looking at this as an option realistically versus others. So is it, if I'm looking at textiles, or if I'm looking at the paper products industry, or if I'm looking at things where labor is the largest component of what I'm doing, are those going to be the ones that we want to say, look, let's really say that's not going to be about this. It's going to be more about supply chain resilience and having a fallback plan or some other mechanism versus the activity of maybe someone who an industry 4.0 type scenario, the automation that's coming in, the digitization that's coming in, create some opportunity for people to say, look, this can create some different type of cost parity.
Yeah, you brought up textiles, and I think that's an excellent example. So textiles are pretty fully automated. Even textile production in the Carolinas, for example, which is the major area in the US where you would see textile production, that's all done by machines. I mean, people are not doing hand weaving or that sort of thing anymore. However, in the sewing industry, apparel and footwear that uses textiles, that is very labor intensive. So, it's a strategy that you would want to look at specifically by the segment of the industry, and then look at a global strategy for manufacturing. So it's no longer I'm going to manufacture in America or I'm going to manufacture in China. It's not those kind of choices. It's where in the world should I manufacture and why? And how do I segment the industry? So should I keep the sewing factories in low cost countries like China and Bangladesh and some places in Africa and even Myanmar and places that are doing high labor touch, high touch manufacturing, and then consider manufacturing textiles in a highly automated environment like the Carolinas in the US. So it's complicated. It's not a simple decision anymore. It requires a different executive level of input and different strategies and thoughts, and it's complicated and usually an executive level decision.
Yeah, and I would think that in some of the industry sectors, there's a policy component that would have to be coming in as well. If we're in elements of, like we saw during the pandemic, the PPE shortages or other things like that, do those things become things that become national stability or security type issues that we want closer, which I'm not sure that on an individual, because there is a cost question, and we'll jump to Caitlin, the next slide, if you would, that this notion of, the cost optimization and cost competitiveness is what's front and center in people's mind of saying, that's great. I think that's a great idea, but I can't compete. And so now what?
Right. So, you introduced a topic that's near and dear to my heart these days, and that's industrial policy. So
Yes.
During the pandemic, we recognize we have risk in our supply chain. There are things that we don't make here, and that puts us at risk, like building blocks for pharmaceuticals, PPE, medical equipment and devices, medical consumables. All these things are not manufactured here, and I think everyone recognizes they should be. At least some part of it should be. and that's related to industrial policy. So should the government support these kinds of industries that are critical for us to survive? America doesn't have industrial policy. So that was a surprise to me. I thought, wow,
Right.
how
Yeah.
can that be? But there is, the common thought was we operate in a free market environment, and everybody should produce what they make money at producing, and there is no room for the government to join in and direct that policy. However, I think the pandemic really exposed the risk and the need for the government to step in and say, we must manufacture certain things in America in order for Americans to survive. So it's a change in ideas. And the other thing is, most countries around the world have industrial policy.
Right.
Mexico does, Canada does, uh, France does. France supports their aeronautics industry through industrial policy.
Absolutely.
China has made in China 2025 policy. So it's sort of time we consider this and step up and understand that we have to mitigate our risk.
And so we'll get into this, and thank you, Caitlin, for launching the second poll question as we look at the results. I think to your point, it's a complicated matter. It's not, there's cost optimization, there's cost components that come to the equation that we as executive leaders within XYZ company or industry can take a look at and influence. And then there's things that we have to look to influence or lobby for at a different level if we really believe that we're in a sector, or we're being told we're in a sector that is critical to our economy, of how we manage that and move that forward in a way that we can be competitive on a global scale as well. Interesting. Yep. So looking at the results of the next one. So I think, Caitlin, go ahead to the next slide. And Rosemary, why don't you go ahead and introduce, because this was a survey that the Reshoring Institute launched. Give us a little bit of context and background, and then we can compare the results that we saw.
Yeah, so for quite a while, we've been saying that we know that Americans prefer products made in the USA, and they would pay more for them. So to confirm that and to formalize it, we did a study in October, and we surveyed 500 people across the US. Actually, it was about 497 or something like that, but close to 500 people across the US. And these people were in all kinds of age groups, from about age 18 to 80, I think, over 80 years old. So a wide range in ages, as well as educational backgrounds. So we surveyed people from high school degrees all the way through PhDs. We did the survey across America in every region in the U.S. So we didn't just focus on California or Texas, it was clearly across the U.S. in every state. And we had some results that we thought were pretty interesting. So first of all, we asked very simple questions. Do you prefer products that are made in the USA? And somewhere around 70% of the respondents said yes.
Was there a breakdown within that? Because in our poll, we have 90%, right? That's saying it's not a smaller audience, but in this poll that we just did, it was a 90% preference for made in USA.
Well, this was a simple answer to the question, do you prefer products made in the USA? And our results were about 70%. And that was pretty consistent with other polls that we've seen in the past. Of course, you can see in this in the top chart that 16% were not sure, so that would bump it up quite a bit as well. But so let's just say conservatively, 70% of the population would rather buy products made in the USA. And then we asked them the second question, would you pay more for products made in the USA? And about 60% of the people said yes. Now, if you were to take this same survey about 10 years ago, you would find people would say no. They prefer low-cost products, and that, the rise of like Walmart, for example, that was importing lots of products and at inexpensive prices were contributing to the rise in consumerism, or even Amazon, where you can compare prices. However, what our respondents said was that if a product was made in the USA, they now prefer it and would pay more for it in the US. So 60% said they would pay more. I think if you go to the next page, we can make some other things. Yeah. Okay. So after we said, would you pay more for it? Then we said, how much would you pay for it? How much more would you pay for it for products made in the USA? And about 83% said they would pay up to 20% more. So 10% of the people said, or 50% of the people said they'd pay 10% more, and 32% said they would pay 20% more. So altogether, people, the respondents, said they would pay up to 20% more. Now, this is really, really important because when we analyze total cost of ownership, we know that if we can get pricing within about 15% of the cost of manufacturing it, say in China, if we can make it in the USA for about 15% more or less than that, but somewhere in that range, that we can sell it for more money. And so it makes the economic case on our behalf. We can sell these products at a little higher rate, and even if we have to pay a little bit more for it to be manufactured in the US, we can make it work. So this is a very important statistic for us.
Absolutely. We'll keep going, and then I'm going to ask you a question on this as we go into the next pieces of the survey.
Okay, so then I have lots of experience in manufacturing in China, and a lot of products, most of our products touch China in some way or another. So we know that China is certainly capable of producing very high quality products. In fact, they manufacture Lamborghinis in China. So high quality brand name goods that are manufactured there. So what was interesting about the study that we did is that people were willing to just pay more for products made in the USA without any qualification about quality. And so we simply asked, once again, do you think that products made in the USA are better quality? And 46% said yes. Now, we didn't offer any evidence. We didn't say US versus China or US versus Mexico or higher price product. We didn't make any qualifications at all, none. There's just this simple perception that products made in the USA are higher quality. So that was really interesting to us. So here we have a US population of consumers who are willing to pay more for products made in the USA. They prefer products made in the USA, and they think they're higher quality. So it was sort of an eye-opening, simple study for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I think if you go to the next slide, Caitlin, that draws those conclusions, Rosemary, that you just went through. But when we tie it back then into the cost basis, so now it goes in and says, that's great, right? So I prefer to buy in the US. I'm willing to pay more for that. I perceive that it's going to be a higher quality. As a manufacturer, I need to be able to go in and hit that marker. So if it's a tolerance of 15, 20%, that is, and my labor rates still have a significant difference, and we'll talk about those segments again, there's other things. Like in our case, from a 3G perspective, we're obviously looking at how tools and digitization and all of the automation components can come in and say, we can help reduce the overall cost of doing business because of X, Y, Z. But just from your own studies and experience, Rosemary, speak to some of those things of what folks out there are doing to get to that price of cost competitiveness in order to make this a reality.
Yeah, so, I'm thrilled to say that these days people are making supply chain decisions that are based on a total look across the supply chain. So back in the day, I graduated from college and then got my master's degree, and we were in industry in silos. So at Hewlett Packard, for example, our logistics group just played within logistics. We didn't really talk to manufacturing or other than, we were looking for the goods they produced and then how would we distribute them. Today's environment is very, very different. So in the last 20 years, people that have studied supply chain, and because of the rise of ERP systems and other software systems, we now can really look across the supply chain, and that includes upfront forecasting and planning, um, production planning, manufacturing, logistics, distribution. All of that is, the total look across the supply chain, which is a completely different view from what we have seen in the past. So we would look to optimization in all sectors. So not just how do we automate production, but how can we make better use of software across the entire spectrum of supply chain, including logistics and distribution, to optimize those prices. So now we're looking at things like how do we build production so that we can make full truckloads and ship out full truckloads?
Right.
Backwards, 30 years ago or so, we had no clue. I mean, we just took what came off the production line and managed logistics with it. So in today's environment, it's much more integrated, much more sophisticated.
What was interesting is I always take the example out of the pharmaceutical industry, and it's my own take on it. I don't think it's off on it, but for many years, the pharmaceutical industry, certainly the logistics activity in particular, was an afterthought because it was about getting that product to market. It was about the very high margins that existed during that time. So logistics was a component, but as generics came up on the rise and these activities started to go in, it started to pressurize and logistics started to have more. Now we have the pandemic that's occurred. Now we have security elements that are going in. And so you've got this activity that I think is driving the logistics and supply chain even more to the forefront than it's ever been in a lot of these sectors. And I think that's a worthy discussion point that I think we've circled on for a number of years. But I sometimes wonder if we take it in all seriousness. We've made advancements, but when you really look at transportation and logistics, it's one of the least advanced, I would say, relative to some of the other things that have happened.
If this may date me a little bit, but do you remember the TV series All in the Family with Archie Bunker? Yeah. Archie Bunker was a traffic manager, so he worked on the dock at his work, wherever it was. And back in those days, there was no integration, there was no software, there was, he was just taking shipments and moving boxes around. Today's environment doesn't look like that anymore. And we're likely to see supply chain people at the executive level. So a chief supply chain officer, a COO, these people are responsible for what happens along the supply chain. So you can see it's now an executive decision. It isn't just pushing boxes off the dock and trying to determine, what trucking company you're going to hire to move those. This is a full integration and a strategic decision in a completely different way, requiring different education. I mean, we now see lots of supply chain people with advanced degrees, a lot of university focus on training supply chain people because of this more sophisticated and integrated approach to supply chain, as well as the software integration. I mean, now we have tools that we can actually use that are going to make a difference. So no more Archie Bunkers,
Yeah, well, and it's yeah, exactly. That's a funny one. When I'm thinking about some of the constraints that are in the marketplace today. So as we're thinking about it, if you flip over to the next slide, Caitlin, we're just going in and it's really talking about capacity issues and constraints, and a little bit of a bridge from where you just went, Rosemary, which was we have these things that are coming up, but we also, as we're looking at reshoring or an activity, we have driver shortages, we have an aging driver population, we have changes in dynamics of people wanting not to do long hauls, but doing regional kind of more short haul activities. They want to be able to be home in the evening. We have the supply chain aspects, obviously, on the inbound. So speak a little bit from your perspective of what you're seeing in the U.S. marketplace as capacity issues and constraints, and then some of the opportunities. Like I see huge opportunity with the new influx of folks coming out of universities that are looking for technology-led, that are thinking through different activities, but we have to appeal to them as employers. We have to appeal to them in a different way. It's not about moving the box. It's about solving a much bigger problem.
Yeah, I would argue that supply chain these days is all about moving information, not about boxes. So
it's a great way to put it.
It's important that you know where the information is coming from and how you use that to optimize your supply chain. So you need to know when there are delays or there are issues, or how you organize the supply chain in order to take advantage of full truckloads and so forth. Another thing you mentioned is this issue of driver shortages, and this is, I don't know, a really difficult problem to solve. You're right. We have a significant shortage of truck drivers across the nation, and and people aging out of the system. So we need to figure out a better way, and some of that may be through autonomous vehicles, or organizing in a different way that optimizes the load, so we don't need as many drivers, or different ideas with respect to information management and movement. There are, driver shortages for sure, but there's worker shortages all across the U.S. There are millions of open manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and nobody applying for them. I talked to a company earlier today who was saying, they had over 100 job openings and only 2 people applied. And
Wow.
I know, I know, it's just
Wow.
amazing. Anybody who wants a job can certainly get a job these days. But on the other hand, shortages are causing us a lot of heartache in order to move our goods. And of course, there are other factors such as port congestion. I live in Silicon Valley, and near the Port of Oakland, which is about an hour north. You can look out and see ships for as far as you can see that are waiting to get into the port to unload because there's
Right.
so much congestion. So that's a huge issue, as well as these black swan events like the Suez Canal and
Yep.
so forth that cause all these ripple effects throughout supply chains.
Well, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I read a McKinsey study, a McKinsey Global Institute study, and it said something like you can expect a supply chain disruption that impacts 1 to 2 months of your activities or your profits, really, to happen every 3.7 years. And I think it was every 7 years, that would take 40+% of your profits away. That's extraordinary, right? And I have to pull it up, so don't hold me to it, but it's McKinsey Global Institute, and it's something in that neighborhood. And I think when you look at that, that has to go into the cost equation, and the other elements too of saying, look, if I need to solve these problems, I also need to understand the things that I'm facing, right? So when I'm looking at capacity and constraints, and I need to make it more appealing to drivers, do I drop the age from 21 to 18? Do I do this? Do I do that? How do I make things more appealing in the manufacturing environment? Is it a pay wage? Is it being part of an automated environment that's more exciting? I don't know what those elements are, but when I look and say that if every 7 years I have 40% of my profits at risk, or whatever that number is, that's extraordinary. I'm looking and saying, wow, I've got to figure this out and take that into my cost equation as well.
Yeah, and I think it's looking at it from a different angle as well. So, it's not like events haven't happened before. I mean, we've had
Right.
tsunamis, and we've had fires, and we've had hurricanes and earthquakes, and so these things have happened before, but they were all looked at as potential risks, and how would you respond to a risk? Today's environment, we've got to deal with climate change, which is going to increase these kind of events. We're likely to have another pandemic or 2 or 5 or 10 over the next few years. So,
So keep your mask close. That's what you're saying.
Really. So it's important that we now evaluate risk from a different kind of planning perspective. It's no longer just a response. I mean, we need to plan for disasters, right? And know how we're going to respond, and have an idea of what to do and what steps to take. So, it's this whole shift in the idea of transportation management, for example, that used to be execution oriented. So it was all about how do I get things moving, right? So it was the execution side. And you can see that in the last few years, there's been acknowledgement that we also need to think of the strategic side. So we need people that can do strategic planning, that can come up with responses to these kind of things that are going to happen. So you need both. You need the strategic planning, the understanding of potential issues, as well as a proper execution side where people are more aware.
Completely. I mean, I just look at our own micro view to it. So if we look at it, we're obviously in the TMS environment. We've got the planning component of it. We also have the execution component because sometimes it is just about moving. And sometimes in planning, stuff happens, right? So and you have to be able to react. And so your plans go out the window. And so we're needing and we're seeing and are broadening our own ecosystem of what comes into play because people need alternatives. And just as our supply chains generally are pressurized when there's something happens, so do the systems have to react. It's something that we're very focused on and I think is critical to enabling that. We did have a question. Caitlin, are we good to take a question kind of on the fly? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's just fine. I was
All
going
right.
to say we could do them at the end, but that'd be fine if you guys want to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to go in because it's on the cost piece.
Yes, absolutely. So this question came in earlier. When discussing consumer habits, is there a variance between the people saying what they'll do, like paying up to 20% more for the US made products? And then they also asked, are there manufacturers currently within that 20% that are outselling foreign made competitors?
So in other words, do we have proof points that when someone says I'm going to pay more, they actually do? And folks that are making that story fly.
Yeah, so it's kind of too early to say, but I get asked that question a lot. So what people say they're going to do and what they actually do is maybe different. But even if we were to say, right now we say up to 80% of the people would prefer to buy American-made goods. Even if we were to reduce that some percentage, you can still see it's directionally correct, right? So some people may say they pay more for a product and then don't, but many of the people are willing to pay more for products made in America. And I think this is a change and a trend that we've seen over the last few years in particular, where people are really more aware of where things are made and why they want to support manufacturing in America. So the question, will they do what they say they're going to do? I think we're moving in that direction, right? For sure.
And Rosemary, in the sectors or in the companies that are global, that have a presence in Europe, that have a presence in the US, what is made in America or made in Europe? What does that mean? Is it that I'm actually segmenting and I'm having a regionalistic approach to my supply chain and to my sales?
That's a great question. So I can tell you that up until maybe a couple of years ago, anything made in America and labeled that way was a hot seller in China. So as the rise of the middle class in China
Absolutely.
became
Yeah.
very visible, they looked and sought out for goods made in America. I mean, they loved American brands and so forth. And then, because of the political environment and the trade war and the anti China sentiment introduced by the previous administration, um, Chinese citizens are like, now they avoid American made products in a lot of cases. So, and they're being fed that through their government, who is taking an anti American stance, just as we did take an anti China stance. So, there is changes in the political environment that are going to drive changes in consumption around the world. But I can tell you that, working with the group of colleges in Makers Rise in Europe, um, they did a number of studies as well and found, just as we found, people prefer products made in their country. So, made in the UK, for example, is very popular. Made in Italy, there's a strong feeling by Italians that products made in Italy are better. So, and perhaps they are. I mean, they make Lamborghinis and fancy cars and
Yeah.
wonderful suits and so
I
forth.
get some good wine. Yep.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So there's a perception around the world that there's some sort of tribalism that products made in your country are superior in some way or another, at least some of the products. And then there's also the political environment that drives, that drives sentiment or anti-sentiment around the world too. So that's a complicated question to answer as well.
Yeah, and well, it's always yeah. I think the whole thing is complicated because when I look at it and I look all of the pulls and pushes that go in and say, you're almost going back in time of needing to have a regionalistic approach, and yet the cost is prohibitive, and so all of the efficiencies and all the gains of globalization, and I think it's what's it called now, slowbalization, where we're not as global, but we're not completely reverted either.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic that's tough to figure out. And I'm thinking that, automation obviously plays a role, but it's not the only
Absolutely
factor that comes into making that cost, which is our next slide, Caitlin, if you go into it, which is driving that optimization within the manufacturing environment. What other elements can we talk to, Rosemary, about that, of things that folks should be thinking about in the audience, or how they're approaching it, of what can be optimized and what can counterbalance, I guess, for lack of a better way, some of these other things that are just realities, right? There's a reality in the marketplace.
Yeah, absolutely. A reality in the marketplace. I think so. The difference is globalization is here and it's here to stay. There's no question about that. And some of the supporting trends of that are this idea of cost structures around the world, but also the internet. I mean, just think, 25 years ago, you couldn't just search on the internet for some product in China that you needed. And
Right.
that's not true today. Today, you can find all kinds of manufacturers all over the world and services all over the world. And you simply click on them and you get their phone number, their email address, or, it's easy, right? And so the rise of the internet has contributed to some of these trends too, which, is little, when you think about it, it's like, holy cow, it's not just a matter of me opening a market somewhere in Africa or something like that. It is
Right.
the rise of the internet, the rise of globalization, and there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. The difference is, I think we're moving and maturing and evolving into thinking about globalization in the way of optimizing your worldwide networks. So you may choose to manufacture in China and also in Taiwan and also in Mexico.
So what
And
they call the parallel supply chains.
it was parallel supply chains and multi-point supply chains. So we never did that before. It was like, well, we manufacture here or we manufacture there, or we, two places or something. Now it's a very global view where there's multiple manufacturing sites that you can move and shift manufacturing between those sites in case there is, a black swan event, a pandemic, or a tsunami, or a fire, or a flood, or something happens. You have options.
Right.
And we didn't think of it that way in the past.
So when someone is looking at it, I'm just thinking, because it is overwhelming, right? And someone's just sitting there and they're saying, look, we have these pressures, we'd like to do this. Where do I turn? Is it technology first? Is it information first? Is it a different thought process?
So that's a very good lead in. I have written a book called the Reshoring Guidebook. I'm about to publish a second edition, but in the guidebook, I talk about the multi dimensions of these kind of decisions. So, here is another thing that's very obvious to me. Back in the day when I was a dock supervisor out of college, I managed a shipping dock. I didn't think about all these other issues. It was just about getting stuff off the dock, getting production off the dock. Today, it's an integrated decision. So it's not only thinking about what do I have to distribute, what is my logistics component, but how will the system support that? How can let me give you another example. So you order something on Amazon, and every day you get an update on where it is, if it's going to be delivered.
Yep.
If it's going to be there overnight, or it's a longer delay, or you're getting this information all the time, and it's taught us to expect that. So
That's right.
is the facilitation. It's the backbone. It's, moving that information is so important. In fact, in some cases, more important than the physical movement. You need the information to know how you're going to plan. Are you going to meet the customer requirements? Are you going to have your raw materials on time? You need that information to make the whole supply chain work.
Right, right. Perfect. And I'm going to hold my question for a second because I think it's going to build off. Caitlin, go ahead to your next slide, please. Because Rosemary, you've made the point on kind of the middle class, right? So we've come in the U.S. where we started to have more of the upper echelon and the lower echelon, and we've lost a little bit of the middle class. And your perspective is that in rebuilding, this is a key aspect.
Yeah, so, it used to be that manufacturing back in the 1960s or so, manufacturing was about 30% of our economy. If you look at China, it's about 80% of the economy. So we know that economic health is built on the backbone of manufacturing, for sure. Today's environment in the US, manufacturing contributes only about 11% to our economy. Mm-hmm. So we have greatly reduced our reliance on manufacturing. And what happens when you do that is you begin to separate the haves from the have-nots. And you create a lot of low-income jobs, McDonald's workers and so forth, minimum wage people, and then the upper echelons, which are the senior executives. And in the middle of that is manufacturing. So recreating manufacturing jobs in the U.S. rebuilds that economic health. And part of the reason is because manufacturing jobs pay a middle class wage. So most manufacturing jobs pay between about $45,000 and $85,000 a year. That's the average. And, while you starve to death in Silicon Valley on those kind of wages, in most of America, that is squarely a middle class wage. And what we know about people that earn a middle class wage is they buy houses and they buy cars and they buy big screen TVs and they go out to dinner and they have their hair done and they send their kids to college. And that has a magnifier effect overall on the economy. So we always say, we take the low end magnifier effect and say it's about 1.4 times magnifier effect for every new manufacturing job. But I've seen statistics as high as 11 times. So for every manufacturing job, the effect on the economy is enormous. And that's why so many of our politicians say jobs, 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 jobs. Right. Now, the other thing is that we don't want the 23-cent an hour T-shirt production back here.
Right.
Because it doesn't pay a living wage. And if it doesn't pay a living wage, then we have to supplement people's income with welfare. And we don't want to do that, right? So what we want are well-paying manufacturing jobs that pay a middle wage, and those are usually more technology-oriented, that will help rebuild that hole in the middle class that we've created over the last 25 years.
So that kind of leads into the last point of our session, which is that it's not just the customer experience, because that's part of it, right? Because now I've got something that's closer, but you were just talking about the whole experience, the middle class experience, the economic experience, everything kind of starts to grow upon itself.
Yeah, and like we were saying before, it's no longer just execution, it's also strategy. So we have to have a big picture landscape look, but we also need to know how to execute every day. I mean, you can't ignore one or the other. It's just an expansion of the way we look at supply chain these days with both components.
That's excellent. Thank you, Rosemary. It's Caitlin, there's 10 minutes and we can continue talking, and Rosemary and I can talk for a long time in general, but I want to give some opportunity to the audience if there's any questions that folks might have that they'd like to submit. I think everything and anything is on the table, from the tools that are available to what you're seeing from economic conditions to things if you've been trying to drive an internal debate or discussion within your company about changing how you're manufacturing or what you're doing, and having some struggles and would like some advice. I think everything's on the table for a question.
Well, so I like to just add to that, there are multiple dimensions to this whole idea of reshoring and rethinking your global supply chain. One of them also that people should keenly be aware of, that leaving a foreign country is not that easy either.
Right.
So, for example, if you're leaving China to go to another country, you would expect to pack up your machine tools and things that you sent there, molds and dies and your machine tools. And I'm here to tell you, I've had these tough conversations with CFOs before. You're never getting that stuff back. So even though you think you own it, the Chinese perspective is once you've shipped those machine tools and dies, to China, that they own them and becomes part of their infrastructure. And the other thing is the government is never going to let you export them from China either. So you have to expect to write that off. If you are you have plant there and you have employees, and most Chinese employees are on contracts, and that means that when they come to work for you, they sign a 1 or 2 year contract. So if you shut down the plant there, you have to pay out to the end of the contract. So that's a big expense that people don't expect. So there are complications leaving foreign countries that need to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah, well, that's the theme, right? There's lots of complications, but I think the question becomes, do those complications mean that we don't enter the debate or the discussion? I think the answer to that is no. We have to have it. There's too many other factors that are coming in, and we see it. There's the Taiwanese chip manufacturer that's opening a facility in Arizona now. There's other things that are going in because we want to be near. You made me think of an example on the die cast that I want to say that it was Intel years ago, and what they would go in when they were putting things in, it was maybe the previous generation, right? Still producing, but previous generation technology. And part of the Chinese government had been to, no, it must be current pieces because for exactly what you said, right? We want to have that capability. So I think it's, I think it's interesting. It's complicated. I think whether it's U.S. domestic reshoring activity or expansion or reasons not to offshore, if I'm a smaller entity that's looking at things, or I'm Europe-based, there's many factors. Technology plays a part of that. And technology, from your point, Rosemary, of information, I think is a critical component. I also think information technology is a critical component to recruiting talent. And being cutting edge and having those types of activities.
Yeah, I mean, we're all used to, searching on our phones for stuff. And I mean, technology has become second nature to everything that we do. And, do people really want jobs that don't involve technology in some way or another, right? Whether it's the use of tools or the use of the internet or the use of computers on the shop floor. Yeah. That's really important.
Absolutely. And Caitlin, I don't think we got any questions in, so people are being shy, or we answered all the questions that are going in. But what we can do in parting is, you've got the information for both Rosemary and myself up on the screen. Rosemary mentioned the books that she's already put out, the second edition that's coming in. We love and enjoy talking about this.
The survey that we went through yesterday is available on our website at reshoringinstitute.org. Right from the landing page, you can click on it and see the full survey.
No, I appreciate that, Rosemary. Thank you for everybody who participated. Caitlin, I think we're good on this side, and we'll look forward to speaking again, Rosemary. I think it's always fun, and I really appreciate you agreeing to join us today.
Sure, thank you.
Yes, thank you. You guys have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.